Australia didn't run out of houses overnight. It wasn't one law, one policy, or one bad decision. It was a chain reaction. A slow-motion disaster created by choices that seemed harmless, even helpful. Education, immigration, labor shortages, and housing markets collided. And the result is a crisis no one planned and no one prepared for. This is the hidden story of how good intentions created one of the biggest housing shortages in modern Australian history. For decades, Australia's education system was viewed as a source of national pride. A network of world-class universities offering opportunity, knowledge, and a pathway into the global economy. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, something changed. Funding from the government began to shrink. Universities, desperate to maintain their programs, staff, and research, had to find new ways to survive. And so, international education transformed from an academic mission into an economic engine. Australian universities expanded their presence across Asia, building recruitment networks that resembled corporate sales pipelines rather than academic exchange programs. Independent agents became the face of Australia's education system in India, China, Nepal, the Philippines, and beyond. These agents earned commissions for every student they secured, turning education into a high-stakes marketing operation. Over the past decade, almost 4.6 million migrants arrived in Australia. 1.66 million of them were international students. That group became the single largest component of the country's migration intake. But here's where the shift becomes crucial. Treasury assumed only 16% of international students would eventually receive permanent residency. In reality, the figure was over 40%, nearly triple the expectation. What began as a financial lifeline for universities gradually turned into an unofficial immigration stream. Students weren't just coming to study, many were coming for the possibility of staying. And because education was tied to visas, and visas were tied to future residency, the incentives quietly reshaped the demographic landscape. Australia's education system wasn't just educating global learners. It was producing permanent residents, at levels no one had planned for. This sudden and sustained rise in population, especially in major cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, placed enormous strain on one resource that wasn't expanding fast enough. International students needed rentals. Graduates needed units to live in. New residents needed homes to buy. And the problem didn't stop there. The next shift deepened the crisis even further. The type of migrants arriving changed the composition of Australia's workforce. Immigration isn't just about numbers, it's about skills. After World War II, Australia welcomed large waves of migrants from the United Kingdom and Europe. Those migrants brought with them one very important asset: trade qualifications Australia recognized. Bricklayers, plumbers, carpenters, roofers, electricians. They entered the workforce ready to build the suburbs that supported a booming population. But the migration wave of the past 20 years looked very different. The majority of new arrivals came from Asia, where trade qualifications were not automatically recognized by Australian standards. Even when applicants had skills, licensing bodies rarely granted direct equivalency. Many were required to retrain, repeat apprenticeships, or pass lengthy assessments. Processes most simply avoided because time and cost made the pathway unviable. So, what type of students came? Mostly commerce students, business majors, IT students, hospitality trainees, and cooks. All respectable professions, but not the ones needed to build houses. As the student-driven immigration boom expanded, the number of incoming construction workers shrank. The pipeline for electricians, bricklayers, and carpenters dried up. And while some migrants eventually entered trades, the numbers never matched historical patterns. Meanwhile, the cultural shift within Australian families reinforced the shortage. More parents encouraged their children to go to university instead of apprenticeships. Academic degrees became the default aspiration. Trades, once respected and lucrative, were seen as second-tier options. The result was a slow, silent crisis. Population increased. Housing demand exploded. Construction workforce remained stagnant. For nearly 20 years, employment in construction failed to grow proportionately, even as Australia added millions of new residents. The mismatch widened. Demand skyrocketed, while supply capacity remained frozen. And then, a pivotal moment arrived. A moment that briefly paused the crisis, only to intensify it later. Australia's housing undersupply didn't begin in the last few years. It began almost 2 decades ago, when population growth accelerated faster than home building capacity. For 15 years, demand quietly outran supply. Developers built thousands of homes, but new residents needed tens of thousands more. The gap widened year after year, but because it grew gradually, it was easy to ignore. Then came COVID-19. Borders closed. International students left. Migration paused. Suddenly, for the first time in over a decade, housing demand dropped sharply. The pressure on rentals eased. The buying frenzy slowed. For a brief moment, it looked like the housing shortage had vanished. But it hadn't. Australia didn't build a surplus of homes. Population growth simply stopped long enough to mask the shortfall. The moment borders reopened, the crisis snapped back with full force. But this time, the gap was much worse. Millions of people re-entered the system. Students, migrants, temporary workers. Universities restarted their international recruitment pipelines immediately, eager to recover lost income. The construction industry, however, didn't bounce back with the same speed. In fact, much of the sector was weaker than before. Material shortages, labor shortages, rising costs, bankrupt builders. Construction capacity struggled to keep up with even modest demand, let alone the surge that followed reopening. Vacancy rates plummeted, rental prices spiked, buyers faced historic competition. The housing shortage that had been building for years re-emerged, sharper, deeper, and more severe than before. But to understand the crisis fully, we need to look at the psychology and incentives behind every decision. The story of how each institution acted rationally on its own, but collectively created a national problem. It's easy to search for villains in a crisis. Blame the universities, blame the students, blame the government. But the truth is more complex. Every group acted according to incentives that made perfect sense at the time. Universities needed funding to survive. When government support declined, they turned to international students, a legal, profitable, and widely encouraged strategy. Students pursued education in Australia for better opportunities, global mobility, and a pathway to a stable future. Parents encouraged their children to enter universities rather than trades, believing degrees offered prestige and financial security. Governments promoted population growth to support economic expansion, tax revenue, and labor needs. Employers in non-construction industries welcomed educated migrants who contributed to the service economy. Individually, each decision was rational. Collectively, they created a perfect storm. A rapidly growing population, a shrinking construction workforce, a housing market unable to keep pace, and a system that no longer recognized the skills of many migrants, even when those skills were urgently needed. The situation became a textbook case of what economists call unintended consequences of good intentions. Universities strengthened their finances, but indirectly contributed to rental pressure. Families encouraged higher education, but unintentionally reduced the domestic trades workforce. Migration policies welcomed students, but underestimated how many would stay permanently. Governments promoted growth, but didn't ensure housing could keep up. Developers tried to build, but couldn't find labor fast enough. The result was not a coordinated failure, but a coordinated success that produced an accidental crisis. The next chapter explores the shockwave hitting ordinary Australians, the people paying the real price. The consequences of these intersecting crises are now felt in every corner of the country. For many Australians, the dream of owning a home has shifted from difficult to nearly impossible. Renters face record low vacancy rates, bidding wars for basic apartments, and price increases that far outpace wages. First home buyers compete against returning migrants, investors, and rising construction costs. Regional towns that once offered affordability now face shortages as population pressures spill outward from the major cities. Students, both local and international, struggle to find accommodation at all. The pressure on social housing has intensified. Temporary migrants occupy rentals once used by low-income families. International students fill city apartments once taken by young professionals. Couples and families who once bought small houses are left fighting for scarce rentals. The construction workforce, already stretched thin, cannot produce homes fast enough. Every missing carpenter, every unlicensed electrician, every declined qualification adds weeks or months to project timelines. Meanwhile, investors capitalize on scarcity. Land prices soar. Developers hold back new projects until profits are guaranteed. and public frustration grows. The crisis is not just economic, it is social. It shapes families, it delays milestones, it shifts aspirations. It influences everything from birth rates to mental health. Australians now live in an era where housing defines opportunity, where you live determines how you live. And yet, few understand the deep, interconnected system that created this moment. But the story isn't over, because the final chapter examines what can be done, and whether Australia can escape the paradox it created. Fixing Australia's housing crisis requires more than building homes. It requires unraveling a system that took 20 years to form. The solution is not to end international education. It's not to stop migration. It's not to force every teenager into a trade. Instead, experts propose a combination of reforms. 1. Recognize more international trade qualifications. Streamline pathways for skilled migrants already trained in carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, bricklaying, and roofing. 2. Reinvest in Australian apprenticeships. Subsidize training. Improve wages. Elevate the status of trades. Restore pride in practical professions. 3. Balance migration streams. Ensure skill-based migration keeps pace with student-driven migration. 4. Increase public and affordable housing programs. Governments must build, not just incentivize developers. 5. Reform university funding. Reduce the dependence on international students, so education is education, not a financial survival mechanism. 6. Improve long-term housing planning. Supply must be matched to demographic forecasts that reflect actual migration patterns, not outdated assumptions. Whether these changes happen depends on political will, public pressure, and institutional courage. But there is one undeniable truth. Australia is not facing a single crisis. It is facing a chain reaction of interconnected choices. The education system needed money. Migration needed pathways. The economy needed workers. Families sought opportunity. Universities pursued growth. Governments wanted expansion. Everyone acted with good intentions. And together, they created a housing shortage that reshaped the nation. The question now is simple, but critical. Will Australia continue down a path shaped by unintended consequences? Or will it recognize the pattern in time to change the future? The next decade will reveal the answer.